One of the things you mentioned a couple of times was the role of the OSCE, and that organization, which has been around in several different characterizations, the CIC and now the OSCE, it's very much come to its own, I think, during the Ukraine crisis. I'd now like to introduce Paul Robinson, who is the next panelist. He holds an MA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Toronto and is D.Phil from Oxford. Prior to his graduate studies, he served as a regular officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps from 1989 to 1994, and as a reserve officer in the Canadian Forces. I thought you were from Cambridge, so it's also people from Oxford who do intelligence work, I guess. He also
We're not spies, but
He also worked as a media research executive in Moscow, and he's published 6 books, and he's written widely for the international press on political issues. In recent years, he has worked on Russian history, military history, defense policy, and military ethics, and he is, of course, a professor at the University of Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you. Listening to Ambassador Dan talking about the importance of diplomacy, it did strike me that it would be nice if the Canadian government did any. That's my political thing tonight. Good evening. In his annual speech to the Russian Parliament last week, Vladimir Putin quoted the Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin. Putin has cited Ilyin many times, and on 22nd December, in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of his death, members of the Russian Duma, Federation Council, and Presidential Administration will hold a roundtable discussion of Ilyin's work in Moscow. It would be a bit like the Senate, the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister's office getting around for a seminar on Northrop Frye. Imagine that, if the Senator can imagine such a thing, I imagine most of the MPs would say, who's Northrop Frye? Anyway, the point is, Ilyin is very much the Kremlin's favorite philosopher, so in light of that, I thought it would be appropriate to start with a few words from Ilyin myself. And these are from a collection of essays published in the early 1950s under the title Our Tasks, and this is what Ilyin had to say. Other peoples don't know us, don't understand us, are afraid of Russia, don't sympathize with it, and are happy to see it weakened. We are alone, misunderstood, and unpopular. These words, written some 70 years ago, aptly describe what many Russians feel about their relationship with the West at present. And what I'd like to do tonight is to try and reduce some of the misunderstandings people have about Russia's role in the current conflict in Ukraine, because I really do think that our media and politicians represent a grossly simplified picture of it. For us, the war in Ukraine is a product of Russian aggression, pure and simple. We envision the Ukrainian people as being united and aspiring to a European future. We have images in our minds of peaceful demonstrators coming together on Maidan Square in Kiev to protest against a corrupt government, and then being mowed down by the gunmen of a pro-Russian president. We see the overthrow of that president as a victory for democracy, and we view the war which followed as being a product of Moscow's efforts to destabilize Ukraine in order to force it back into Russia's orbit. Russians, unsurprisingly, see things very differently. And my job here isn't to say whether they're right or wrong, it's simply to explain it. They see things very differently. They see Ukraine as divided. And they regard the overthrow of the freely elected president Viktor Yanukovych not as a triumph of democracy, but as a violent coup d'etat instigated at the behest of Western powers. Russians have a well-established respect for order, having seen the consequences of their own revolution, as well as having lived through the financial and social collapse which followed the end of communism. Many Russians feel that even bad order is better than no order. They seek stability. Russians see the West as seeking the opposite. Across the globe, Western powers have intervened to overthrow governments they dislike in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere. And in their wake, the West has created anarchy, civil war in Iraq and Syria, a failed state in Libya which has spread terrorism and disorder south into countries like Mali, and now civil war in Ukraine. Russians perceive a pattern here. and they suspect that this chaos is not an unfortunate byproduct of our foreign policy mistakes, but is deliberate. And let me quote here Sergei Glaziev, who is economics advisor to Vladimir Putin, and this is what he had to say. And I'm not endorsing it by saying it, please, I'm not a Glaziev fan, but this is what Glaziev has to say. To eliminate the threats to its hegemony from China and the Asiatic states, the Americans are provoking a war in Europe. The United States want to unleash a chaotic war in Europe, wipe out its debts to Russia and Europe, subjugate their economic space and take control of their resources. It is a strategy of divide and rule, generate conflicts and provoke war. Russia is the latest victim of this policy, and the weapon used against it is Ukraine. So we see Russia as destabilizing Ukraine, but Russians see it the other way around. It is the West which is doing the destabilizing. How else, they say, can one explain the West's support for the overthrow of Ukraine's elected president and its subsequent support for a government which shells its own cities and kills its own citizens by the thousand? Now, personally, I think Glaziev's view of the world is paranoid and wrong, but I think that our view is somewhat wrong too. Putin is a conservative. He values stability. So too, as I said, do Russians, which is why they support Assad in Syria, Sisi in Egypt, and so on. Destabilizing other countries is not the kind of thing they really believe in. So let me quote at length from a recent article in National Interest magazine by an American professor, Nikolai Petro, who recently returned to the US after a year in Ukraine. This is what Petro has to say. I do not believe that Russia's strategy aims at destabilizing Ukraine. It is already coping with 500,000 refugees. More instability will only produce economic collapse, a failed state, and millions of refugees. What Russia wants, I believe, is a stable Ukraine that will be able to repay the $30 billion it currently owes Russia in private, corporate, and government debt. But it disagrees strongly with the West about how stability can be achieved. The West is not in the least bit concerned with cultural differences in Ukraine and how they affect politics. It assumes that if corruption is reduced, the economy will grow and cultural divisions will simply fade away. Russia, on the other hand, sees Ukraine as a culturally fragmented society. Corruption feeds on this fragmentation and leads to political gridlock. Peace and stability, therefore, require the legitimation of these cultural differences. Actually, I think Petro is right. Russia did not object to the overthrow of President Yanukovych because he was pro-Russian. In fact, Putin disliked Yanukovych, and the Russian government did not consider Yanukovych pro-Russian in the slightest. They actually preferred Tymoshenko, the predecessor. They got on quite well with Tymoshenko. They signed deals with her and all sorts of things, and they really didn't like Yanukovych one bit. So the fact that he was overthrown, it wasn't the problem was that he was pro-Russian. Okay? On the contrary. Rather, the objection was that the coup destroyed the delicate balance between eastern and western Ukraine which held the country together. Russia's objective is to restore the balance. To this end, Russia does not seek to annex the eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass, nor does it want Donbass to become an independent country. Donbass is not at all like Crimea. In his recent speech, Putin spoke of Crimea in mystical religious tones, as the place when St. Vladimir was converted to Christianity. And then he said rather oddly that Crimea has the same meaning for Russians as the Temple Mount for Jews. Well, I think that's taking it a little bit far. But the point one you could take from this speech is that Crimea is something of an exceptional case in the Russian mind. Psychologically, it's different than Donbass. You know, so Crimea is the sort of foundation of Russian civilization. Donbass is a bunch of comrades. So one should not suppose that because Russia annexed Crimea, it wants to annex Donbass. Actually, the Russian government prefers that Donbass remain in Ukraine. But at the same time, it believes that the people of Ukraine will only agree to that if Kiev compromises politically to grant them a share in the running of the country and to reassure them that their culture is protected. That means giving the Russian language some official status, as well as granting some measure of regional political autonomy. Russian military support for the rebels is not therefore part of some design to restore the Russian Empire. Rather, its purpose has been to force Kiev to the negotiating table, to put it in a position where it has to make concessions. The aim is to bring the war to an end. One can see that this is so by examining what happened when the rebels with Russian support launched an offensive against the Ukrainian army in late August. The offensive smashed the Ukrainian army south of Donetsk. If the aim had been imperial expansion, then the Russian army and the rebels would have kept on advancing once they had the Ukrainians on the run. Instead, as soon as Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said that he was willing to stop fighting, the Russians forced the rebel leaders to sign up to a ceasefire. The rebels didn't want to. This is really very obvious. They were about to attack the port of Mariupol, which was would have been a really major prize for them, but Moscow made them stop. Okay. That is because getting Kiev to the negotiating table was the objective, not capturing territory. In fact, Moscow really actually doesn't want the rebels to be too victorious, because if they're too victorious, then they just make themselves completely independent and won't listen to anything Moscow tells them. Russia's aims are therefore much more limited than commonly understood. This can be seen also in the way in which Moscow engineered changes in the leadership of the rebellion in August. Forcing Kiev to negotiate would be useless if the rebel leaders weren't willing to talk back, and the original leaders weren't. This was particularly true of the primary rebel military commander in Donetsk, Igor Strelkov, who pursued a political agenda which is thoroughly at odds with that of the Kremlin, and who complained incessantly about how he was being stabbed in the back and wasn't being helped by Russia. In mid-August, by means unknown, Moscow found a way of getting rid of Strelkov, and since then other commanders have also, as it were, decided to spend more time with their families. The purpose of the changes is to create a more moderate leadership and also to centralize authority. Far from being orchestrated by the Kremlin from the start, the rebellion in Donbass was overwhelmingly local in origin, with the result that a plethora of independent militias were established, each under their own local warlord. Moscow had little or no control over these people. It is now trying to get some control over them, and to centralize power in the rebel republics in order to remove the more recalcitrant leaders and to increase its own ability to control those who remain. The aim is to produce a credible leadership which is able to re-establish order in rebel-controlled areas and is also capable of negotiating a deal with Kiev. The problem with this strategy is that the Ukrainian government remains stubbornly unwilling to offer meaningful concessions which could persuade the rebels to reintegrate with Ukraine. Even the defeat suffered by the Ukrainian army in August hasn't changed this. The defeat helped to persuade President Poroshenko that he could no longer achieve a military victory, but it did not persuade him or anybody else in power in Kiev to take any measures which might bring about a political solution to the war. Russia is thus stuck with a situation it never wanted, two semi-independent quasi-states in eastern Ukraine, which Russia will have to support financially if it wishes to prevent an economic and humanitarian catastrophe. Whether it will now change its policy remains to be seen. The clues coming from Moscow are confusing, and there's a lot of criminology going on in the Russian press because of various changes of minor bureaucrats within the administration, and people are speculating what this means. It's believed that Putin's primary advisor on Ukrainian affairs is former Deputy Prime Minister Vladislav Surkov. And as soon as Surkov's name is mentioned, criminologists get very excited and start seeing vicious and strange plans going on. He has quite a strange reputation. Anyway, Surkov is viewed in many circles as the leader of the Dubs. Glaziev is more like the spokesman of the Hawks. Now, in November, rumors circulated that Surkov was on the way out, and another official named Boris Rapoport was on the way in, when he was taking charge. And Rapoport was seen as being far more sympathetic to the idea of recognizing rebel republics as independent states. But last week, Rapoport resigned. And then there was speculation in the press about, does this mean Surkov is now back? And lots of headlines saying Russian policy changes, and Russia is now accepting that it cannot have an independent Donbass, and it wants an autonomous Donbass within Ukraine. Other people, though, are saying quite the opposite, and saying, no, Russia is now accepting that it hasn't really got any choice but to accept an independent Donbass. So, frankly, it's impossible to say who is right. You know, it's this old-fashioned criminology. We're drawing sweeping conclusions from tiny little clues. So I'm not going to make any predictions. What I do think one can say, though, is the situation is far more complex than the Western media makes it out to be. As far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, all we hear is Russian aggression, Russian aggression, Russian aggression. But there is a lot more to it than that. By focusing all our attention on Russia, we have lost sight of the local origins of the war, have failed to recognize the responsibility of those in power in Kiev for what is going on, and so have encouraged the Ukrainian government to follow what has proven to be a disastrous line of policy. Russia's complaints about the West's role in destabilizing Ukraine, while not entirely fair, are also not entirely devoid of truth. I started out with a quote from Ivan Ilyin, so I will round off with one too. The West, Ilyin said, doesn't need the truth about Russia, it needs a convenient untruth. Its press is willing to publish all the latest rubbish about us, as long as it is abusive and defamatory. That's rather paranoid, but it is true that we need to reduce the amount of abusive rhetoric and start thinking about Russia in a much more sophisticated way. And I hope that my words tonight will contribute in some small way to that.